To activate a macro, run a macro, execute a macro, play back a macro, and the terms are all pretty much synonymous. In other words, make your macro do what it needs to do. The most common way to execute a macro is by way of a keystroke shortcut, at least initially when you're working with this feature. Let's create a macro in this worksheet here that identifies the cells that have pure numbers in them. And as we create this macro, let's be thinking that maybe this is the kind of macro that we could be using in other workbooks as well. In other words, what if we close this workbook, we're looking at another workbook, we might want to use our macro there as well. This time we want to save this macro in what's called Personal Macro Workbook. So let's imagine that we've identified the steps that it takes to highlight the cells that have numbers in them. We'll start the macro recording process by going to the View tab in the ribbon, choosing the drop arrow for Macros, and Record Macro. We'll give it the macro name Highlight Value Cells. Keystroke shortcut, how about Control-Shift-V? We want to store this macro in what's called Personal Macro Workbook. This is a separate file with the name Personal. If you have not recorded a macro on the current computer that you're using, you are in effect creating this the very first time, and thereafter you're simply adding to it. Any macro you record can be stored here or elsewhere, and it's very easy to move a macro from one workbook to another. Provide a description. If it's a short macro like the one here, that's probably unnecessary, but with longer macros, it's always appreciated when others are about to use a macro. If they see a description, it's going to be helpful. Say we'll ignore it for now. We're going to click OK, and then identify those cells that contain values. We go to the Home tab, choose Find and Select, then go to Special, Constants, and then uncheck the boxes for text, logicals, and errors. Click OK, and we've highlighted all those cells. If we were to click somewhere right now, it would unselect all these. So let's apply a color first. We'll use the drop arrow on the Home tab for fill color. Maybe we'll use one of the greens right here. Although not necessary, we could unselect these simply by clicking in another cell. Maybe it's A1, maybe not. Certainly not a necessary step, but it does unselect them, and then it leaves the highlighting more present. So let's say we've done all the things we want to do. We can stop the macro by clicking the box in the lower left corner next to the word Ready, or going back to the View tab and choosing the drop arrow under Macros, Stop Recording. We can activate this macro. We can play it back, as it sometimes is said, anywhere we want. Let's go to a different worksheet, Sales and Profits. What is the keystroke shortcut? It's Control-Shift-V. There are the cells that have values. Every other cell in this worksheet is a formula. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't, but we certainly know now. There are times when you say, well, can we undo a macro? No, we can't. Now, you might see the undo feature available here, but if I click the undo arrow or press Control-Z, I'm going back to this worksheet. I haven't undone what was done here. You want to be really sensitive to the idea that a macro that could be deleting data, you can't undo it. Now, manually, we could certainly take off this color by highlighting the cells and removing it. But let's talk about some other issues about how we make a macro happen. Let me manually remove the color here, go to the Home tab, simply choose the bucket here, choose No Fill. What if we forget the keystroke shortcut? We can go back to the View tab, the drop arrow for Macros, View Macros. We can view all the macros from all the open workbooks. Of course, we've only recorded very little here, so this workbook, we could narrow it down that way. We haven't recorded any here. We just recorded as in Personal. There it is, and there it is. We can choose Run. Certainly this is not fast, but it gets the job done. Or what if we have a macro, we forgot the keystroke shortcut? So once again, let me manually take off the color here. Back to the Home tab. We forgot the keystroke shortcut. We want to know what it is. Back to the View tab, the drop arrow for Macros, View Macros. Here's the macro in question. Let's go to Options. There's the keystroke shortcut. If we didn't have one, we could apply it now. If we want to change this, we could do that, or we could simply remove it if we don't need to use it anymore. Another way to run a macro, and particularly for a macro that's likely to be used in different workbooks, is to have a button in the Quick Access toolbar. If you right-click the Quick Access toolbar and choose Customize Quick Access Toolbar, it'll take us into the Excel Options dialog box. Choose Commands from, click the drop arrow here, choose Macros. This might be a little confusing at first because you'll see all kinds of terms here that you're likely to be unfamiliar with, system type entries here, but eventually you will see the macro and you will remember its name. Here it is right here. We're going to add this to the Quick Access toolbar. Now, if you're a bit picky and you don't like that symbol, choose Modify. You have nearly 200 choices here. Pick a button for this or that. I'll just use a house. Click OK. And then OK. In any workbook at any time, regardless of whether this workbook is open or not, if we want to run this macro, there it is. We can run it from this button. If the macro is such that we would only use it in a given workbook, and that's not the case here, but just to illustrate the idea, you can also have a macro be accessible by way of a button. And there are any number of different ways to do this, or by way of a graphic as well. Suppose in this worksheet we wanted to use that feature, and there may not be any cells that fit here, or are there? There probably are. What do? We could go to the Insert tab, choose one of the many shapes here. I'll just pick this one, rounded rectangle. Put it here. I could either type in something like RunMacro or highlight cells or find numbers, whatever. We'll get to the formatting later. If we right-click this box, we can choose Assign Macro. And of course, this is the macro we're talking about right here. We'll click OK. Click outside of this. If we click this box, Find Numbers, what does it do? It runs our macro, and it highlights all the cells that have numbers in them. So you can see there are different ways to run or play back a macro. We could have done that also with different kinds of graphics. The ability to not only run a macro, but keep track of macros begins by going to the View tab. This is where we record macros and also where we view macros, possibly either the change keystroke shortcuts or make adjustments to them, such as we've seen.